Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about two women whose names you have heard before, and whose stories you have never actually been told. You think you know the world of Laura Ingalls Wilder? You grew up with it. Maybe you read the books when you were young, dog-eared the pages, watched the television show with the sunbonnet and the prairie and the fiddle music. You know her father. You know her mother. You know Almanzo. You know the hard winters and the small house and the big sky over South Dakota. But tonight, you're not here for Laura. Tonight, you're here for the two girls who stood beside her. The ones who walked to school with her every morning across frozen Dakota ground. The ones who whispered with her in church pews and giggled at dime sociables when the prairie wind shook the walls. The ones who were there before Almanzo, before the books, before the legend. Their names were Mary Power and Ida Brown. And history forgot both of them. Not because their lives were small, not because they did nothing worth remembering, but because neither of them wrote a book. Neither of them became famous. They lived quiet, complicated, real lives. And when they died, the world simply moved on. The only record that survived was the one Laura left behind. And Laura, it turns out, got large parts of their stories completely wrong. For over 50 years, historians believed Mary Power had died young. Researchers assumed she had simply vanished sometime in her 20s or 30s, just another frontier woman taken too soon. That version of events was in the history books. It was cited, repeated, accepted. It was wrong. Mary Power lived to 63 years old. She died in Bellingham, Washington in 1929, a continent away from the little town on the prairie where her story had begun. She outlived most of her generation. She built an entire adult life that Laura knew nothing about. A life with a new name, a new city, and a story no one bothered to find until researchers started digging through census records and newspaper archives decades after her death. And Ida Brown, quiet, shy Ida, with the soft brown eyes and the wavy black hair, named her first daughter after Laura. After the friend she would never see again, she carried that friendship inside her for the rest of her life, pressed between the daily demands of children and farm work and the long Dakota winters, until she died in 1926 without ever writing a single word of it down. Tonight, we're going to find them. We're going to walk back to Smet, Dakota Territory, to the year 1880, when that town was barely more than a railroad depot and a dream. And we're going to follow three girls from their first meeting to their final separation. We're going to understand why their friendship formed, why it lasted, why it fractured, and why the two women who helped shape Laura Ingalls' girlhood were erased from the history she left behind. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you want. Because this story is one of the most quietly heartbreaking things the American frontier ever produced. And it starts with three girls standing in the wind on a prairie that did not yet have a name. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. Tell me if you already knew their names, or if tonight is the first time anyone has told you what really happened to them. You're standing at the edge of a town that does not quite exist yet. It is the spring of 1880. The ground beneath your feet is broken prairie sod, dark, dense, thick with root systems that have been growing undisturbed for centuries. The air smells like turned earth and last night's rain, and something sharp underneath. Something that you will later learn is simply the smell of the Great Plains when the wind comes down from the north. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is just vast and slightly wild and absolutely indifferent to the fact that you are standing in it. De Smet, Dakota Territory. Population approximately 50 people, which is a generous count, frankly. Because some of those 50 are railroad workers who plan to leave by summer, and a few more are land speculators who are just here long enough to file a claim and move on. But some of them are staying. Some of them have looked at this flat, enormous, wind-scoured land and made a decision that belongs to a very particular kind of person, the kind who looks at nothing and sees something. The Ingalls family arrived in 1879. Charles Ingalls had taken a position with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad as timekeeper and bookkeeper. Not a glamorous title, but a stable one, which was something the Ingalls family had not always had. They had moved many times already: Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, another stretch of Minnesota. Each time Charles had believed the next horizon held what the current one did not. Each time, the results had been mixed at best. But Dakota Territory felt different. The railroad was coming. The land was cheap. The government was giving it away, essentially. 160 acres to anyone willing to claim it and prove they could work it. Laura Ingalls is 12 years old when they settle into Smet. She's small and dark-eyed, and possessed of a watchfulness that her father would call practical, and her mother would call too much. She notices everything. She files everything away. It is already the quality that will, 60 years later, make her famous. She does not know that yet. Right now, she is just a girl in a new town, looking for other girls. The Power family arrived around the same time, making their own long journey from Casson, Minnesota. Thomas Power was an Irish immigrant, born in Ireland, arrived in America, worked his way westward in the methodical manner of a man who understood that opportunity rarely landed on your doorstep but could be walked toward, one careful step at a time. He was a merchant by trade, not a farmer. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Merchants were not at the mercy of the wheat harvest. Merchants had something closer to a reliable income, which in a frontier town meant something close to power. His daughter Mary was 14 that year. She was tall for her age and dark-haired. Laura would later describe her with characteristic precision. Smooth black hair twisted into a heavy knot at the back of her head. A dress of indigo blue wool that was longer than Laura's brown one. Indigo wool was not cheap fabric. It was not the clothing of a family scrambling to survive. Mary Power arrived in Smet well-dressed, well-fed, and carrying herself with the easy confidence of a girl who had never had genuine reason to doubt her place in a room. Ida Bell Wright's story began differently. It began in fire. She was born in Chicago on September 24th, 1866, the daughter of Thomas and Catherine Wright, ordinary working people in a city that was, by the late 1860s, beginning to believe it could become one of the great cities of the world. Chicago was growing at a pace that seemed almost unnatural. Wooden buildings going up faster than the lumber could be dried, neighborhoods spreading outward in every direction. It was loud and smoky and full of the frantic energy of people convinced they were building something permanent. On October the 8th, 1871, that conviction became catastrophic. The Great Chicago Fire started in the evening, a single flame. One dry autumn night, one building in a city built almost entirely from wood. Within hours, it had become something that witnesses described not as a fire, but as a wall. A moving orange wall that consumed everything it touched and turned the sky above Chicago into a ceiling of red smoke visible for miles. By the time it burned out 2 days later, approximately 300 people were dead. Roughly a third of the city had been reduced to ash. 17,000 buildings were gone. 90,000 people were homeless. Ida Bell Wright was 4 years old. She lost her parents in that fire. She lost siblings. At 4 years old, in 1871, she became an orphan in a city that was still smoking. The details of her survival are not documented. We do not know who found her, or how she was cared for in the immediate aftermath, or what those first weeks without her parents looked like through the eyes of a small girl. What we know is the outcome. She was eventually adopted by Reverend Edward Brown, a congregational minister, and his wife, Laura Jane Goodale. Reverend Brown was educated, respected, charitable in the practical way of men who believed their faith required action. His household was orderly and safe and religious. For a girl who'd watched her world burn, orderly and safe was probably everything. She came to Smet as Ida Bell Brown, the name she'd taken from her adoptive family. She arrived shy and small and dark-eyed, the pastor's daughter, carrying inside her a history that no one in Smet knew, and that she herself may not have fully understood yet. She was 13 years old, in a town of 50 people. Where other girls her age were a genuine rarity, she was about to find the two best friends she would ever have. Here is what most history books do not tell you about frontier friendships. They were not sentimental, they were structural. Smet in 1880 had roughly 0 girls between the ages of 12 and 16. Laura Ingalls was there, Mary Power was there, Ida Brown was there. That was essentially the entire pool, which means that when these 3 girls found each other, at school, at church, at the handful of social events a barely formed town could manage, they were not choosing from a wide field of options. They were finding the only other people in their world who were exactly what they were. The school met in whatever space was available, no formal schoolhouse yet. A commercial building, a church room, wherever enough benches could be arranged to call it education. The curriculum was straightforward. Reading, writing, arithmetic, the skills that a frontier's girl would need to manage a household ledger and write a letter home and not be cheated at the general store. There were no electives, there was no gymnasium. There was a teacher and a room and children of wildly varying ages sharing the same space, doing their lessons at the same time, competing for the same attention. In that room, Laura Ingalls and Mary Power and Ida Brown found each other. The Congregational Church was the other social axis. Reverend Brown, Ida's adoptive father, was its founding pastor. Charles Ingalls was a founding member of the congregation. The Power family joined as well. So these three families were not just neighbours in a physical sense. They were bound together through the one institution in Smet that made community feel like something more than geography. Church in a frontier town was not only about worship. It was where women organised the Ladies' Aid Society, which ran the charitable activities that kept the community functional. It was where families evaluated each other's moral standing and economic reliability. It was where dime sociables were held, small fundraising events where you paid a dime to attend. The tables were covered in food that the women had cooked, and the entire town crowded into whatever space was available to talk and eat and feel for an evening, like civilization was not so far away. Laura would later write about these sociables with a warmth that reads, across 140 years, as entirely genuine. She loved them. She loved the closeness of them, the way the whole town compressed itself into a single room and became, briefly, a community rather than just a collection of individual houses scattered across an enormous prairie. Mary Power was there. Ida Brown was there. The three of them found themselves time after time in the same church, the same school, the same social events, because those were the only places a girl in De Smet in 1880 could be. But what cemented the friendship, what turned proximity into something deeper, was not the school or the church. It was the winter of 1880 to 1881. It is October of 1880, and something is wrong with the sky. You can feel it before you can name it. The air is too still in the mornings and then too violent in the afternoons. The clouds come down from the northwest in shapes that the older settlers recognise and the newer ones do not yet have language for. And then the first blizzard arrives. Not a snowstorm, but a blizzard in the true meaning of the word. A whiteout so complete that you can walk 20 feet from your own front door and lose the building entirely. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was later recorded as one of the worst on the northern Great Plains in living memory. Over 50 blizzards struck Dakota Territory between October and May. The supply trains from the east could not get through. The railroad lines were buried under drifts that were not measured in inches but in feet, sometimes in multiple feet, accumulating faster than any crew could clear them. For months, De Smet was cut off from the outside world. The town ran out of food, not metaphorically. Not in the way that modern people describe a pantry that is running low. The food was genuinely, measurably, dangerously scarce. Families rationed. The community organised whatever distribution system they could manage. Two young men, Almanzo Wilder and his friend Cap Garland, drove a wagon into the open prairie during a break between storms to find a settler who reportedly had wheat that he could sell. They found him. They came back with enough grain to keep the town alive. Laura was 13 that winter, Mary was 14, Ida was 13. They were old enough to understand that the situation was serious. Old enough to feel hunger and fear and the specific anxiety that comes from watching the adults around you manage their expressions carefully because they do not want to frighten the children, but young enough that their understanding was filtered through the particular resilience of early adolescence, the ability of the young to absorb catastrophe and file it somewhere manageable, to keep going, to still find moments of something like ordinary life even when ordinary life has been completely suspended. They found those moments together. When the blizzards cleared briefly and families could visit each other, they visited. When the school managed to meet, they sat next to each other. When the evening stretched long and cold and the kerosene lamp was turned down to conserve fuel, they remembered. They remembered that the other two existed, that they were not alone in this particular cold, in this particular town, on this particular enormous prairie. There is a quality of friendship that can only be formed in adversity, Astes. It is not the easy, pleasant friendship of good weather and plenty. It is harder than that, and more durable, and made of different material. It is the friendship of people who have been afraid together and survived together, and now carry that shared experience in their bodies the way they carry their own names, automatically, without thinking about it, as a fundamental part of who they are. That is what the winter of 1880 to 1881 gave Laura Ingalls, Mary Power, and Ida Brown. By spring of 1881, when the trains finally broke through and the first shipment of supplies reached Smet, and the whole town allowed itself to collectively exhale, these three girls had something that most people go their entire lives without finding. They had each other, and they had no idea yet what the world intended to do with that. Spring came to De Smet the way it always did on the northern plains. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a door being thrown open after a very long time closed. The snow retreated, the mud arrived, ankle deep and the colour of dark coffee, the kind that grabbed your boot heel and held on for personal reasons. The prairie grass returned slowly, pale at first, then that particular shade of green that only exists on the northern plains in May, clean and almost violent in its brightness after so many months of white. The supply trains broke through, the store shelves filled. People stood outside and breathed the fresh air with a particular relief of people who were not entirely sure at certain points this winter that they were going to make it. De Smet had survived. It was the spring of 1881. Laura Ingalls was 14 years old. Mary Power was 15. Ida Brown was 14. The three of them had just come through something together that most adults would have struggled to name cleanly, and they emerged from it the way people sometimes do, quieter, tighter, and carrying a knowledge they had not asked for and could not set down. The long winter had done something to all three of them. Not in the dramatic, visible way of a wound you could point to, but in the deeper way of a cold that gets all the way into your bones and changes how you hold yourself for years afterward. They were girls who had watched their town run out of food, who had sat with their families and shut down houses and listened to the wind strip the buildings for 5 months, who had learned, at an age when most people are still learning how to conjugate French verbs, that the world could simply decide to stop cooperating, and there was nothing you could do about that but wait. You do not come through something like that without being changed by it. And you do not come through it with other people without being bound to them in a way that ordinary friendship does not quite explain. But here is the thing about bond forged in crisis. The world does not stay in crisis. The crisis ends. The trains run again. The shelves refill. Life resumes its ordinary texture. And the question that the ordinary world asks, with more insistence every year, is not what you survive together. It is what you intend to do next. And here is what you need to understand about a young woman's options in De Smet in the early 1880s. They were, to put it plainly, not numerous. You could remain at home and manage domestic labour until you married. You could work in a family shop if your family had one. You could take in dressmaking or laundry, piecework that paid in dimes and quarters and kept your hands busy without going anywhere near your ambitions, assuming you had any. Or, if you were literate, mathematically capable, and willing to stand in front of a room full of children who would test every last edge of your authority, you could teach. Teaching was the one professional door that stood genuinely open to women in Dakota Territory in the 1880s. It required a certificate, which required passing an examination administered by the county superintendent. It paid a real salary. It granted a social standing that purely domestic life could not offer. And it allowed a young woman to delay marriage, earn money of her own, and exist in the world as something other than a daughter waiting to become a wife. Laura Ingalls sat for that examination in December of 1882. She was 15 years old. She passed. This was not a small thing. 15-year-olds did not typically hold teaching certificates. The story, corroborated in Laura's own later writings, was that her father had done some careful persuading on her behalf just to get the examining board to let her sit at all. But she sat, she passed, and she walked out of that examination with something that neither Mary Power nor Ida Brown had: an official role, an income, and a trajectory that pointed deliberately away from the ordinary. Laura's first position was at a school called Brewster, a single building on open prairie, roughly 12 miles from Smet. The distance was too far to make a daily round trip in a Dakota winter, which meant she lived with the Brewster family during the week and came home only on weekends. 5 days out of every 7, she was gone. Think about what that meant for the three of them. The friendship they had built over 2 years was not a correspondence friendship or a Sunday friendship. It was ambient, woven into the fabric of daily proximity. Same schoolroom, same church pews, same handful of social events. Their closeness had been built on repetition, on the small accumulated weight of being in the same place at the same time, over and over, until being together felt less like a choice and more like weather. Now one corner of their triangle was absent from Monday morning to Friday night, every week. Mary and Ida were still in Smet. Their routines continued. But a triangle with a corner missing does not function the way a triangle is supposed to function. The 2 remaining corners hold, but they hold differently, with a new awareness of the space that used to be occupied, a new tendency to notice the absence every time they sat in the church pew and the seat to the left was empty. Laura came home on weekends, and when she came home, something new was happening. And Almanzo Wilder was 25 years old and already well known in Kingsbury County for 2 things: the quality of his Morgan horses and the stubbornness of his opinions. He had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1879, filed on a homestead and a tree claimed south of town, and was building a farm operation with the methodical determination of a man raised in a prosperous New York farming family who intended, by sheer force of effort, to replicate that prosperity on the Dakota Prairie. He was tall, he drove fast. People respected him in the particular way that small frontier communities respect a man who consistently does what he says he will do. He was also 10 years older than Laura Ingalls. Sometime around 1883, Almanzo began providing Laura with transportation between Smet and the Brewster School, picking her up on Friday afternoons in his horse-drawn buggy and returning her on Monday mornings. In a town the size of Smet, this was not a quiet act. There was no such thing as a quiet act in Smet. Everyone saw it. The whole community understood what it meant. Mary Power and Ida Brown understood what it meant too. They watched their friend, already differentiated from them by her teaching career, already operating in a different social register, now become visibly coupled with an established older man. Laura Ingalls, at 17, was being courted with increasing openness by a 27-year-old farmer who owned Morgan horses and a land claim and a reputation. The social arithmetic was unmistakable. Laura was moving into adulthood faster than anyone around her. There is a particular quality of feeling that arises when your closest friend begins pulling ahead of you in the invisible race that adolescence runs without announcing itself. It is not jealousy. That word is too simple for what this actually is. It is something more tangled than jealousy, something that contains genuine happiness for a person you love, and, underneath that, a quiet, involuntary awareness that the distance between you is growing, that the distance is not going to shrink, that you are watching someone you care about move forward into a life that is going to look very different from yours, and that the forward motion is not dramatic or cruel. It is simply what happens. It is simply time. Laura was not abandoning them. That would have been painful in a clean, nameable way. What she was doing was something more ordinary and more irreversible. She was moving forward, and forward, in the geography of 1880s, Smet meant away. By 1884, Smet had grown to a town of several hundred people. It had banks and churches and a newspaper, the Smet News, later the Smet Leader, that reported on weddings and agricultural prices and the business of a community beginning to take itself seriously. The Congregational Church held regular services. A new school was functioning consistently. The town that had been 50 people and a dream in 1880 was becoming, incrementally, something with weight and permanence. It was in this more established as Smet that Mary Power began to find her own answer to the question of the future. The young man's name was Ed Sanford. He was not a farmer. In a frontier town where the difference between a merchant and a wheat grower could be the difference between stability and ruin, that distinction carried real weight. Ed moved through to Smet's emerging commercial life, the stores, the suppliers, the men who handled the town's economic machinery rather than the town's soil. He was not exceptional in the way that Almanzo Wilder was exceptional. There were no stories told about Ed Sanford's horses or his stubbornness. What he offered was something quieter, and in its own way more durable. He was a man whose livelihood did not depend on whether the rain came. Mary Power was 18, the daughter of an Irish merchant with social standing in the community. She was well regarded, well dressed, and had been watched by young men in that way. Young men in small towns watch a respectable young woman who has passed 17 without being spoken for. Ed Sanford was looking. She let him look. What developed between them was the kind of courtship that de Smet in 1884 considered entirely proper, gradual, visible to the whole community, moving at the pace that a town expects when it considers itself to be observing. Meanwhile, Ida Brown had found her own direction. His name was Elmer McConnell, a farmer, quiet and steady, establishing himself on a tree claim west of de Smet. He was not a man about whom stories were told. He was simply present, consistent, working the land with a patience that matched the landscape. Ida, who had been building borrowed homes since she was 4 years old, first a dead stranger's city, then her adoptive father's household, was about to have a front door of her own kitchen, her own set of daily decisions. It is easy to underestimate how much that means until you have spent your entire life in rooms that belong to someone else's story. For her, it meant everything. The dime sociables still happened. They were not optional. The church organised them, and the church's view on attendance was identical to the community's view on it, which was that you came. But something had shifted in the texture of those evenings by 1884. The room was fuller now, more people, more noise, more competing conversations. The particular intensity of the three-girl friendship, which had been partly a product of scarcity, of there simply being no one else, was loosening under the weight of a community that had grown large enough to dilute intimacy. Scarcity creates certain kinds of bonds. Abundance loosens them. This is not a flaw in the friendship. It is physics. The three of them still found each other across those crowded rooms, still stood near the same table, still leaned together when someone said something requiring a private comment. But the whispered conversation was shorter now. The glances across the room landed and then moved on, pulled by the new social complexity of a town that had grown too large for everyone to know everyone's business automatically. A friendship that meets mostly at church socials is a friendship living on memory more than on new experience, and the three of them, without discussing it, without naming it, could feel that shift happening. The way you feel a tide going out, not because you watch it, but because the ground beneath your feet is just slightly less wet than it was an hour ago. In August of 1885, Laura Ingalls married Almanzo Wilder. The ceremony was small and deliberate. Reverend Edward Brown, Ida's adoptive father, officiated. The wedding took place at the Brown residence. Laura wore a black cashmere dress, not the white a bride might have been expected to choose, because she had already decided she would wear it again as everyday clothing, and white does not survive farm life. That single decision tells you more about who Laura Ingalls was than most things she ever wrote about herself. She was already thinking past the ceremony, already calculating the shape of what came after. She was 18 years old, and marrying a man of 28 in a place where sentiment was a luxury and practicality was a survival strategy. Mary was there, Ida was there. Both of them stood in that parlour and watched the friend they had walked to school with, shivered beside in church and grown up alongside step across the line that separates girlhood from something else entirely. 3 months later, precisely 3 months, Ida Brown crossed that same line herself. The wedding was on December the 3rd, 1885. The newspaper recorded it the way small-town papers record small-town weddings, briefly, formally, with the tone of an institution trying to be both official and warm at the same time. Elmer McConnell and Ida Bell Wright, adoptive daughter of Reverend and Mrs. Brown, were married at the Brown residence. The notice said they would make De Smet their future home. She moved into Elmer's world as Ida Bell McConnell. She was 19. She had now been Ida Wright and Ida Brown, and was now Ida McConnell. 3 names threaded through historical records, each one marking a household she had arrived in through accident or charity or love. This last name was different. This last household was hers by choice. And notice, pay careful attention to this, the name she and Elmer gave their first daughter, born the following year in 1886. Not Ida, not Catherine, for the biological mother she had lost in the fire when she was 4. Not Jane, for the adoptive mother who had raised her. Laura. There is only one woman in Ida McConnell's life significant enough to name a daughter after, and she had watched that woman become a wife in her father's parlour 4 months earlier. Ida could not have known, on the day that daughter was born, whether she would ever see Laura Ingalls Wilder again. She probably hoped she would. She probably told herself the distance was manageable, that the friendship was not ending but only changing shape, the way friendships do when life starts asking people to be in different places at once. But she named the girl Laura anyway, just in case. Now here is where the story changes. Here is where the 3 girls stop sharing the same story and begin living 3 completely different ones. Laura and Almanzo walked out of the Brown house on August 25th, 1885, into the late summer light of a Dakota afternoon, and into a first year of marriage that she would later call, now with characteristic precision and zero self-pity, simply the first 4 years. That title is accurate only in the way that difficult weather is accurate for a hurricane. Within weeks of their wedding, a hailstorm struck their nearly ready wheat crop. Laura would write about it years later. The sky going wrong too fast, the sound arriving before the ice, and then the fields simply destroyed. In Laura's own account, Almanzo stood in the ruined wheat for a long time afterward and said nothing. A year's work, gone. The debt borrowed against that harvest was not gone. That remained, patient and indifferent. Mary Power Sanford, meanwhile, was settling into a household that did not plant wheat. Ed's position in De Smet's commercial life meant that the hailstorm that destroyed Laura's crop was, for Mary, simply weather. Unfortunate, certainly, worthy of sympathy. But not a direct blow to her family's finances. The man who manages the town's commerce does not suffer personally when the harvest fails. That is precisely the distinction between planting and selling, between the agricultural economy and the commercial one, and in the brutal arithmetic of the 1880s frontier, it was not a small distinction at all. Ida McConnell on her tree claim west of town was somewhere between the two. Her husband was a farmer, like Almanzo. Her circumstances were more modest than Mary's, but a tree claim west of De Smet is not the same as a homestead further out, and Elmer McConnell was, by all available evidence, a steady man who did not take risks he could not absorb. By 1886, the 3 women's daily lives had become nearly impossible to compare. Laura was on a claim shanty with Almanzo, managing debt and weather and a first pregnancy. Her daughter Rose was born December 5th, 1886. Healthy, loud, destined to complicate her mother's legacy in ways neither parent could have imagined. Ida was managing her own first pregnancy on the McConnell tree claim, preparing for the daughter she had already decided to name Laura. Mary was in De Smet, in a household with different rhythms, quieter, more stable, with more room between one crisis and the next. The currency of friendship is shared experience. When your closest friend's daily life looks nothing like yours, you do not stop caring about her, but you have to start translating. You have to explain rather than simply assume. You have to work to bridge a gap that 2 years ago did not exist. In 1880, Laura and Mary and Ida had not needed to translate anything. Their lives were identical in outline. Same town, same school, same church, same frozen winters, same uncertain springs. They had spoken the same language without thinking about it. By 1886, the translation was already beginning. And it was about to get much harder. In 1887 the drought arrived, not as a single catastrophe but as a slow grinding diminishment. Less rain each month, the wheat coming in thinner and paler than it should, the soil beginning to crack in patterns that experienced farmers recognised as a sign of something that would not improve quickly. Almanzo replanted. He borrowed against the next harvest. He told Laura it would be better next year. Laura had grown up hearing that sentence. She knew the exact register in which a man said it, the tone that means less what it claims to mean, and more that the speaker needs you to believe it with him, because the alternative is to look directly at what you are both standing in. She believed it anyway. 1888 arrived, and with it, the thing that would finally break the fragile geometry of what they had been trying to build. It started with a cough, not even a remarkable cough, not at first. In a Dakota February, everyone coughed. The cold got into the air itself, dried out your throat, made your lungs feel like they were coated in something that had no business being there. You lit the stove before dawn and breathed that air that had ice in it. Almanzo had been working outside since before first light, the way he always had, the way he always would until the day he couldn't anymore. So when he started coughing in the winter of 1888, Laura did not stop what she was doing. She could not have known. There was no way to know, not yet. The disease moving through the Dakota settlements that winter, diphtheria, caused by the bacterium Corynebacterium diphtheria, did not announce itself differently from any other winter illness. It entered through the mouth and nose like everything else. It settled in the throat. Then it built. Doctors who examined severe cases described what they found, in terms that lodged in the memory and refused to leave. A thick grey membrane spreading across the back of the airway, leathery, dense. A biological wrongness taking up space where air was supposed to move. It grew steadily, tightening the passage, turning breathing from something the body managed automatically into something that required conscious effort. In children, it could close the airway entirely within hours. In adults, it moved more slowly, which in some ways was worse. It gave the patient enough time to understand exactly what was happening. There was no vaccine. The diphtheria antitoxin would not exist until 1894. In 1888, medicine offered supportive care and hope, and in serious cases, which carried mortality rates that could reach 20 to 30%, not always enough of either. Both Laura and Almanzo contracted it, both of them in the same house, with a toddler in a small bed nearby and a winter outside that did not care what was happening inside. Laura's case resolved in weeks. She was shaken, stripped of weight she could not spare, and exhausted in the way of a person who has been frightened down to the cellular level. But she recovered. She stood up. She went back to work. Almanzo did not stand up, not in the way he had before. Here is what happened inside his body, and it matters that you understand it precisely, because it explains everything that came after. Diphtheria does not always confine itself to the throat. In severe cases, the bacterial toxin passes into the bloodstream and attacks the peripheral nervous system, the network running from the spinal cord into the limbs, governing movement, sensation, balance, and the accumulated physical confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life doing demanding physical work and had never once had reason to doubt his body's cooperation. Physicians in 1888 had no precise term for what they were observing in their patients. They called it a stroke of paralysis. They noted the weakness in the legs, the difficulty walking, the loss of strength, and they told their patients what medicine of that era told everyone with nerve damage. Rest. Wait. Be patient. Almanzo rested. He waited. And then the farming calendar arrived, the way the farming calendar always arrived, indifferent to what the household had been through, requiring what it required. He went back to the fields before his nervous system had finished its repair. He climbed back onto the plough before his legs were ready to bear the repeated strain of that work, and the healing that had been slowly, quietly proceeding stopped, fixed itself permanently into damage. The limp that Almanzo Wilder walked with from that point forward was not something he would recover from over another winter of rest. It was the rest of his life. He was 30 years old. Laura watched this happen from inside the same small house where it was happening. She watched her husband, a man whose physical capability had been one of the fixed points of their life together, a man who could outwork anyone in the county and had for years done exactly that, become a man who needed help with his coat buttons on cold mornings. She watched it, and she did not collapse under the watching. She put on her boots and went out to the fields. She was 21 years old. She ploughed, she planted. She managed the livestock and the household with the same hands, on the same days, often at the same hours. She did, without commentary and without anyone particularly noting it, the physical labour of two adults on a farm already operating at a loss. She brought in the harvest, what there was of it. She kept the accounts, what there was to account for. She kept Rose alive and fed and warm through another Dakota winter. This was not heroism in the way the word is usually used. It was just what the situation required, and Laura was the only person available to provide it. You need to understand what was happening to the land around all of them during these years, because it forms the ground beneath everything that follows. The late 1880s brought a drought to Dakota Territory that did not arrive as a single catastrophe, but as a slow, grinding diminishment. Less rain each month, wheat coming in thinner and paler, soil cracking in patterns that experienced farmers recognised as signs of something that would not correct quickly. Wheat prices on national markets had been declining since the mid-decade. The settlers who had arrived during the boom years of 1878 through 1884, lured by government land grants, railroad promotional literature, and the genuinely good rainfall years of the early decade, were discovering that the conditions they had arrived in were not the conditions they would be staying in. Kingsbury County, where Laura and Almanzo and Mary Sandford and Ida McConnell all lived, lost a significant portion of its population between 1887 and the mid-1890s. Family after family, farmers who had come in on the promise of the Dakota boom and exhausted their savings against back-to-back failed harvests, loaded their possessions into wagons and left. The de Smet leader printed departure notices with a regularity that became its own kind of testimony. The population that had built de Smet's churches and schools and ladies' aid societies from nothing was quietly and systematically dispersing. The town itself survived, because a railroad town does not collapse the way a purely agricultural settlement does. The commerce held, the trains kept running. But the community, the specific web of relationships built by specific people over a specific decade of shared difficulty, was being pulled apart by the departure of those people, one family at a time, in a process too gradual to mourn cleanly and too relentless to ignore. This is the world Laura, Mary and Ida were living in when 1889 arrived. The baby was born on July 11th, 1889. He was healthy, he was large, he was the second child, and by the accounts that survived he was looked at by his parents the way parents look at a child who arrives after years of difficulty, with a relief so intense it almost hurts. He had no recorded name. Whether one was chosen and never written down, or whether Laura and Almanzo had not yet settled the question when the thing happened that made it irrelevant, no document tells us. He appears in the historical record and would appear forever after as the baby son of A.J. Wilder. He died on August 7th, 1889. He was 27 days old. Laura wrote about it once, years later, in a passage so compressed it reads less like description and more like a door being held shut with both hands. She wrote that he was taken with spasms and died so quickly that the doctor was too late. 11 words. She never wrote more than that. Not in any letter, not in any memoir, not in any document that has ever been found. The child who looked up at his mother for 27 days and then was gone exists in the historical record almost entirely through his absence from it, through the grave in de Smet Cemetery, with the marker that reads simply, baby son of a J. Wilder. Not even a name, Sisti, just his father's initials and the category he occupied briefly in the world. Laura's younger sister Grace, still living at home in de Smet, noted the death in her diary. She wrote that the baby had died, and that he had looked just like his father. That is the only physical description of him that exists anywhere. What happened next? happened within days. The house caught fire. Prairie fires were not metaphors. They were not background atmosphere. They were a specific recurring feature of life in an environment that combined dry grass, dry wood, dry air, and wind that had no reason to stop. The Wilder home on the tree claim burned. Everything in it burned. The furniture accumulated through 4 years of marriage, the clothing, the kitchen equipment, the small ordinary accumulations that a household builds around itself over time and that feel, until they are gone, like the material evidence that the life you're living is real and permanent. Laura had just buried her son. She had been the mother of a living boy for 27 days. She was now standing with a toddler and a husband who could not plough, watching the physical structure of her life become ash. They moved into a 2-room shanty. The crops that year were failing for the 3rd consecutive season. The debt was substantial and compounding. The Dakota winter was 4 months away. It was at this precise point, summer of 1889, standing in the wreckage, that Laura Ingalls Wilder did something she had never done before in her life. She admitted they were beaten, not out loud, not in any record that survived. What she did was begin the quiet, practical work of planning to leave. While this was happening to Laura, 4 miles outside de Smet on a tree claim that was slowly becoming a memorial to everything that had not worked, 2 women in town were navigating the same regional collapse from their own angles. Mary Sanford's household had a quality in 1889 that most households in Kingsbury County could not claim. It was still standing. Ed's position in de Smet's commercial economy meant that the drought crushing the farming families was not, directly, destroying the Sanford finances. The bank that held the mortgages did not lose money when the harvest failed. The farmer lost the money. The institution that had lent it to him did not. This is not a moral observation. It is simply how economic positioning functions in an agricultural crisis, and the Sanfords were positioned on the side of it that did not collapse. But Mary was not insulated from what was happening around her. She was living inside the wreckage of a community she had been part of since she was 14 years old. She was watching families she had known at church, at school, at every dime sociable since 1881 load their wagons and disappear down the road that led out of Kingsbury County. She was watching de Smet contract around her in ways that the town's commercial survival did not fully compensate for. The stores still opened. The trains still ran. But the specific people who had made de Smet feel like a place worth being in, many of them were gone. And somewhere in that disappearing map of people, Laura Ingalls was 4 miles away in a burned house with a fresh grave beside it. Did Mary go to her? The historical record does not answer this. 4 miles of Dakota Prairie in summer was manageable. A short buggy ride, a long walk. The distance was not the obstacle. What we know is that the de Smet leader reported the baby's birth and death, that Grace's diary recorded the death, and that Mary lived in the same small town where those newspapers circulated and those diaries were written. She would have known. Knowing and going are 2 different decisions. The historical record preserves only the first. Ida McConnell, on the tree claim west of town, was in circumstances closer to Laura's than to Mary's. Elmer was a farmer, working through the same drought conditions that were burning out every agricultural operation in the county. He was planting in soil that was not cooperating and borrowing against harvest that the weather was deciding before he had a chance to. Ida was managing the daily operation of a farm household with a 3-year-old daughter, the daughter she had named Laura, a name now attached to a woman who was living through something Ida could not have imagined naming a child into. Whether Ida found her way to that tree claim in the weeks after the baby died and the house burned, we do not know. Whether she sat with Laura in the particular silence of a woman who has lost a child, not fixing anything, not solving anything, just being present in the way that presence communicates what language cannot reach, we do not know. What we know is that by the winter of 1889, Almanzo's parents had made the journey from Spring Valley, Minnesota, to see for themselves what the Dakota years had produced. What they saw was their son walking with a cane, their daughter-in-law managing everything, their granddaughter in a 2-room shanty with debt underneath it, and a winter coming and burned land around it. They did not need to make their case in words. The case was visible. They urged Laura and Almanzo to come to Minnesota in the spring. The Ingalls family knew before it was official. De Smet always knew. Charles and Carolyn, still on 2nd Street, would have watched the quiet preparations with the particular grief of parents who understand that a child is leaving and that the leaving is the right decision, and that neither of those facts makes the other one easier to hold. In the spring of 1890, Almanzo sold the sheep. And these had been Laura's sheep in everything but legal title, bought with the wages she had saved from her years of teaching before the marriage, when she had been a 15-year-old girl with a certificate and a salary, and the beginning of something that belonged entirely to herself. Selling them liquidated the last asset that had originated in her own independent earning. The money went toward the cost of going. In May of 1890, the Wilders loaded what remained of their possessions into a covered wagon. Rose, 3 years old, sat in the back. Almanzo held the reins with hands that ached on cold mornings. Laura sat beside him. They drove through De Smet on their way out. No account survives of what that passage looked like. Whether people came out to the street, whether Mary Sandford was among them, was whether Ida McConnell had driven in from the tree claim to stand on a De Smet corner and watch. None of this was written down by anyone who was there. What was written down, in the plain factual language of people who recorded departures the way they recorded everything else on the frontier, was simply that they had gone. De Smet fell away behind them. The prairie opened up. The flat horizon that Laura had looked at every day for a decade became, with each mile, something she was looking away from rather than toward. It shrank to a dark line. It disappeared. She did not write about that moment. She never described it in any letter or memoir or conversation that was later recorded. Whether she looked back, we do not know. Mary Sandford was 24 years old. He is still in De Smet with her husband in a household that the agricultural collapse had not destroyed. She and Ed would stay for another decade before their own trajectory pointed west, eventually in the early 1900s to Bellingham, Washington, where the Pacific coast offered a different kind of future than the Dakota plains had provided. Ida McConnell was 24 years old, still on the tree claim with Elmer, still working the land, still raising a daughter named Laura, who was too young to understand why the name her parents had given her connected to anyone in particular. The McConnells would stay in the De Smet area through the early 1890s, proving up on the claim with the exhausted persistence of people who had invested too much to walk away without something to show for it. And Laura was gone. She was in Minnesota by summer, in a farmhouse that belonged to her husband's family, recovering from things that the medical vocabulary of 1890 had no adequate language for. She was 23 years old. She'd survived the loss of a child, the near loss of her husband, the destruction of her home, and the end of a decade she had built herself into from almost nothing. The friendship she was leaving behind was not formally over. There had been no ending conversation, no ceremony, no moment anyone could point to afterward and say, that is where it stopped. That is never how it happens. Friendships that dissolve by circumstance rather than conflict do not announce themselves. They become letters that arrive less often and then stop. They become occasions you mean to write and don't. They become people you carry in your memory as the version of themselves they were the last time you saw them. Not the person they are now, not the person the years have made them, but the outline, the voice, the exact way a face looked when it was young, and the world was still mostly ahead of it. Laura carried them both. She carried Mary's dark hair and her indigo wool dress, and the particular quality of her confidence, the easy assurance of a girl who had never had genuine cause to doubt her place in a room. She carried Ida's quietness and the way she listened, and the fact that somewhere back in De Smet there was a small girl with her name being raised by a woman who had thought her worth naming a child after. She carried all of it east on that wagon seat, her shoulder against Almanzo's, her eyes on the road ahead. And she was carrying something else too, something she would not discover the full weight of until years later, when she finally sat down and tried to account for it. She was carrying every story she had ever lived. She just didn't know yet what she would eventually need it for. Picture De Smet on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1890. The wagon that carried Laura and Almanzo east toward Minnesota has been gone for weeks. The wheel ruts it left in the road have been rained on and walked over and driven over and are now simply road again, indistinguishable from all the other marks that wagons have left on this particular stretch of Dakota earth. The town has not paused. It has not marked the departure. It has continued doing what small towns do, which is absorb the losses of their people, the way soil absorbs water, quickly, completely, leaving almost no visible trace of what was there. The Chicago and Northwestern line still runs. Trains still pull into the depot on schedule. The commercial district on Calumet Avenue still functions. The hardware store, the dry goods merchants, the bank, the newspaper office where the Smet leader is set in type each week and distributed to the households that remain. Charles and Caroline Ingalls are still on 3rd Street, older now, their household quieter without Laura in it. Carrie and Grace are still at home. Charles's health is beginning to show the strain of a life that has asked more of his body than most bodies are designed to give. The town is alive. The town is functioning. What the town is not anymore is the place it was in 1880, when every person in it was still deciding whether it was real, when the act of simply staying felt like a collective act of faith, when the whole project of Smet was held together by the specific people who had arrived in those first years and decided together that this was going to become something. Most of those people are gone now, and 2 of them are still here. Mary Power Sanford was 24 years old when Laura's wagon disappeared down the road east, and the first thing to understand about her life in the 1890s is that it was, by the standards of Kingsbury County in that decade, genuinely stable. That is not a small thing. Stability in Smet in 1890 was an achievement. The agricultural crisis of the late 1880s had not finished its work. The families who had borrowed money during the boom years to finance their homestead operations were still, in many cases, unable to service those loans. Foreclosures were continuing. Land was changing hands, moving from the people who had broken the sod and planted the first crops into the ledgers of the institutions that had financed them. The commercial landscape of Smet was reorganizing around who had managed to hold on and who had not. Ed Sanford was on the holding on side of that ledger, and Mary was in his household. He had not planted wheat that failed. He had not borrowed against a harvest that the weather consumed. His position in Smet's commercial and financial structure meant that the shocks destroying the regional agricultural class were not, at least not directly, destroying the Sanford finances. Their roof was theirs. Their food was reliable. Their financial position was not the position of a couple lying awake calculating whether they could stay in the house next month. Mary could sleep. But what did she do while she was awake? This is where the historical record becomes almost entirely silent, and the silence is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Mary left no letters that have been found, no diary, no personal documents of any kind. She exists in the 1890s almost entirely through external facts, census entries, the occasional social mention in the Smet leader, the routine documentary residue of a respectable married woman in a small town who was conducting her life without doing anything that required explanation. She was not teaching, she was not running a business, she was keeping a household, in the same way that married women of her era and class kept households, as a full occupation that consumed the day completely and left almost nothing in the kind of records that historians later read. Her younger sister Elizabeth was still in the Smet area. Her parents, Thomas and Elizabeth Power, the Irish immigrants who had moved from Casson, Minnesota to Dakota Territory in 1880, were still in Kingsbury County. The Power family network was still present, still anchoring Mary in the geography she had grown up in. But Laura was gone, and whatever remained of the friendship between them had been reduced, by geography and circumstance, to what could fit inside an envelope. If letters passed between Laura and Mary during the 1890s, none have survived. This absence is worth naming directly. By the 1890s, Laura was already a woman who understood letters, who used them, who valued them, who would eventually become one of the more prolific correspondents of her generation. The bulk of the Laura Ingalls Wilder papers are held at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa. The South Dakota State Historical Society maintains materials related to Smet's history. Researchers have spent decades working through both collections. No letter to Mary Power Sanford has been found in either archive. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Historians are right to say this, and letters were lost with great regularity, burned in stoves in cold winters, when paper was worth more as heat than as sentiment, misplaced across generations, simply gone. The non-existence of surviving letters does not prove that no letters were written, but the absence rhymes with everything else we know about what happened to this friendship. The geography that separated them was growing, not shrinking. The consuming demands of Laura's successive years in Minnesota, then Florida, then Missouri, were not the demands of a life with much room in it for maintaining connections to the past. Every year that passed without a letter was a year in which writing the first letter again would require more explanation, more catching up, more bridging of a gap that had widened while neither of them was watching. Some gaps get to a width that makes the bridge feel impossibly long, and then the years pass, and you tell yourself you will write soon, and soon becomes a season, and a season becomes a year. And eventually the person on the other side of the gap is someone you carry only as a memory rather than as an ongoing fact of your life. Ida McConnell's 1890s looks nothing like Mary's, and not only because Ida was farming. She was on the tree claim west of De Smet with Elmer, breaking Prairie, planting the federally mandated trees in soil that had no natural inclination toward planted saplings, managing a household and raising children through the same drought conditions that had been the background noise of everyone's life in Kingsbury County since 1887. The McConnell household in the early 1890s was the particular full, exhausting domesticity of a farming family that had invested too much in a specific piece of land to walk away from it, without something to show for the investment. And children came through those years, a daughter, others. The census records give us names and ages and the bare bones of sequence. They do not give us what the kitchen smelled like, or what Ida thought about while she worked, or whether she ever looked at her oldest daughter, the girl named Laura, now 5, now 7, now 10, and felt the particular bittersweet quality of a name that connected her to someone she no longer knew in any present tense sense. She had known Laura Ingalls for about 4 years, in the most compressed and intense way that two people can know each other, the way people know each other when they are 14, and the world is still mostly in front of them, and proximity feels like permanence. That version of knowing does not survive a decade of separate geographies and separate daily realities and no correspondence. It calcifies into something that is simultaneously precious and inaccessible, a memory so old it has become almost fictional, belonging to a self that the current Ida McConnell had grown so far past that she could barely recognise the girl who had stood next to Laura Ingalls in a church pew and thought that friendship was a permanent condition of the world. The tree claim became theirs. The McConnells stayed. The drought years ended and the county began its slow recovery, and Ida continued the daily work of a farmer's wife on the northern plains into the new century. Quietly, competently, in the way of people who understand that the work does not stop requiring them regardless of how they feel about doing it. But De Smet knew her name. Her neighbours knew her face. The church knew when she arrived and when she sat down and when she stood to leave. Nobody was writing any of it down. By the time the 1900 federal census was conducted, the three trajectories that had been set in motion by marriage and geography in 1885 were fully established and fully distinct. Laura Ingalls Wilder was in Mansfield, Missouri, at Rocky Ridge Farm, a 40-acre property on an Ozark hillside that she and Almanzo had purchased on September 21, 1894, and had been slowly, stubbornly making productive ever since. The apple orchard was in, the farmhouse was improving, Rose was 13 years old. The farm was not yet generating substantial income. That would take more years of work. But it was theirs, and they were staying. Then, and that fact alone represented something that the previous decade had repeatedly threatened to take from them. Laura was 33 years old. She had been gone from De Smet for a decade. She was becoming, in small but accumulating ways, someone who wrote things down, not books yet, not the series that would eventually reach millions of readers, but the practical journalism of a farm woman who understood language and had opinions about agricultural life that other farm women recognised as true. Mary Sanford was 34, still in De Smet. Ida McConnell was 34, still west of it. And the distance between all three of them, not just in miles, but in the daily texture of three lives that no longer shared a single point of reference, was by now the dominant fact of whatever the friendship had been. Sometime in the first decade of the 20th century, Mary Power Sanford and her husband Ed left De Smet for Bellingham, Washington. Bellingham sits at the northwestern edge of the continental United States, on Bellingham Bay, where Puget Sound reaches toward the Cascade foothills. It is a city of grey-green light and salt air, and mountains that appear and disappear behind weather systems coming in off the Pacific. It is as different from the flat, treeless, wind-scoured Dakota Prairie as any place on the same continent can be. The distance from De Smet to Bellingham, roughly 1,400 miles as the crow flies, is less interesting than the difference in what those miles contain. The Missouri River, the Rockies, the Columbia Plateau, the Cascades, the final drop into the coast. Mary had grown up in a family that moved toward opportunity. Her parents had moved from Ireland to New York, from New York to Minnesota, from Minnesota to Dakota Territory. The move to Bellingham was the next iteration of a family pattern already established. The Irish immigrant calibration toward the horizon that looked most promising. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s was building itself around timber, fishing, and the commercial infrastructure of a young regional hub. Bellingham had been incorporated in 1903 through the consolidation of several smaller settlements, and was growing fast, not on the promise of free farmland, but on the promise of a diversified economy that did not depend entirely on whether the wheat came up. For a couple like the Sanfords, with some capital, some commercial experience, and no agricultural roots compelling them to stay in Dakota Territory, Bellingham offered something De Smet in 1900 could no longer credibly promise: room to grow. The 1910 federal census for Whatcom County, Washington, places a Mary Sanford in Bellingham, the right age, consistent with everything established about Mary Power's trajectory. She's in her 40s, she and Ed are in the household together. There are no children listed, a consistent fact across every census record associated with the Sanfords, in De Smet and in Bellingham, across every decade of available documentation. Whether this was circumstance or health or choice, the record does not say. What it means, practically, is that Mary's daily life in Bellingham was organised around herself and Ed, and whatever community they built in the churches and social organisations of their adopted Pacific Northwest town. It was a quieter domestic life than Ida's, in the way that a childless household is structurally quieter, more self-contained, more oriented toward the two of them. She had her sister Elizabeth, with whom she apparently maintained contact. She had the Power family name, which she continued to use as a middle identifier, Mary Power Sanford in the records that listed her fully. The Irish immigrant inheritance threaded through the American married name, still there after decades. She didn't have the friendship of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was in Missouri writing newspaper columns for the Missouri Ruralist, and slowly, decade by decade, becoming the woman who would eventually write the Little House books. They were alive simultaneously, these two women, breathing the same American century. Mary in the grey Pacific light of Bellingham, Laura in the Ozark autumn of Missouri. The distance between them was not quite 2,000 miles by rail. The distance in the lived reality of their daily lives was immeasurable. Now, here is the thing that stops you cold when you find it in the historical record. Around 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down to write what she called her autobiography. She was in her early 60s, famous in her region as a journalist and public figure, being urged by her daughter Rose to transform the story of her childhood into something publishable. The result was the Pioneer Girl manuscript, a handwritten draft of her own life, covering the years from her earliest memories through her marriage and the early Rocky Ridge years. It was the raw material from which the Little House books would eventually be shaped. She wrote about De Smet. She wrote about the school and the church and the social life of the community she had grown up in. She wrote about the people who had been her world during those years. She wrote about Mary Power, and in that manuscript she wrote about Mary with the particular tender distance that people use when writing about someone who is gone. Not gone as in moved away, gone as in dead. She believed Mary Power had died young. Let that sit for a moment. Laura and Mary had been, in the early 1880s, either two of the most intimate friends in a community small enough that everyone knew everyone's daily movements. They had sat beside each other in the same schoolroom for years. They had stood in the same church week after week. They had been close enough that when the friendship frayed, it was not the fraying of an acquaintance, but of someone who had known you at the most formative version of yourself, the version that no longer existed in any other living memory. And yet, within 50 years, Laura had lost track of her so completely that she could not distinguish between "I don't know where she is" and "she must be gone." She was not gone. Mary Power Sanford was alive in Bellingham, Washington, when Laura wrote those words. She died the following year, February 20th, 1929, at the age of 63, which means it is possible, even likely, that when Laura reached back into memory to retrieve Mary Power, Mary had already died, and the melancholy quality of the recollection was factually accurate, even if the assumption of early death was wrong. But the possibility that Laura wrote about a living woman as though she were dead, that Mary Power Sanford was in Bellingham, aging into her 60s, while her closest childhood friend in Missouri was writing her off as lost, that possibility is not erased by the timing. It is only made more poignant. Think about what the error reveals, regardless of its precise chronology. These two women had been inseparable. They had survived a winter together that killed people. They had walked the same frozen streets for years, sat in the same church pews, whispered across the same crowded rooms. The friendship had been real, or intense, and formative. The kind of adolescent bond that imprints on the brain with a clarity that outlasts decades. And the decades had done their work anyway. The geography had taken them from 4 miles apart to 2,000 miles apart, to Smet, to Missouri, to Bellingham, the continent spreading between them with each passing year. The silence had accumulated. The version of Mary that Laura carried in her memory was preserved at 23, still in De Smet, still dark-haired and well-dressed and certain of her place in a room. The actual Mary Power, the one in Bellingham, aging in Pacific Northwest light, carrying her Irish middle name into a life that Laura knew nothing about, had diverged from that memory so completely that Laura could no longer tell the difference between the preserved version and the person it used to be. This is not a failure of character. It is the arithmetic of geography and silence applied over 50 years. When you stop knowing where someone is, when the years between contacts lengthen from months to years to decades, at some point the memory and the person diverge beyond your ability to track the distance. You cannot tell "I don't know where she is" from "she must be gone." The uncertainty resolves in the mind into loss, because loss is at least a clean category. Uncertainty has no ending. Mary had not died young. She had died at 63, which is a life. A full, real, 63-year life conducted on two ends of a continent, in two different climates, across a span of American history that ran from the frontier to the automobile. She had been someone's wife and someone's sister, and once, for a set of years that the world has largely forgotten, someone's closest friend. She died without knowing that the friend who had lost track of her was in Missouri, writing a book about the years they had shared. Ida McConnell died 3 years earlier, in 1926. She was 60 years old. She died before the books. Little House in the Big Woods was not published until 1932. Little Town on the Prairie, the book in which a character named Ida Brown appears, small and dark-haired and shy, with the short hairs curling at her forehead, preserved exactly as she was at 13, would not be published until 1941. Ida died without knowing she would become a character, without knowing that the girl she had loved when they were both 14 years old would eventually give her a kind of immortality that was, in its way, both generous and incomplete. A portrait fixed permanently at the age before everything else happened, circulated to millions of readers who would know her as a girl and never as the woman she became. She spent her adult life within the geography she had chosen at 19, Kingsbury County, the De Smet area, the tree claim country where she and Elmer had built the life they built. The records place her there. The census entries confirm her presence, decade by decade, the documentary residue of a woman who stayed where she landed and worked the life she had without making the kind of noise that gets written down. She raised her children. She kept her household. She did the daily undramatic work of a farming woman on the northern plains across 4 decades of American history, through drought and recovery, and the long normalizing grind of a county that had survived its worst years and arrived at something more ordinary. Whether she knew what Laura's life had become, whether she saw the Missouri ruralist columns, whether the name Laura Ingalls Wilder crossed her awareness in any concrete way, the record does not say. She may have known everything about Laura's public work and still never reached across the years to make contact. She may have known nothing. The distance between Smet and Mansfield, Missouri is not the kind of distance that a farming woman in the early 20th century crossed casually in either direction. What she had was a daughter named Laura, now a grown woman by the time Ida died, carrying a name whose full significance her mother had never explained in any document that survived. That was the last deliberate act of friendship, the one done in 1886 when everything was still possible, and the distance was still only 4 miles, and the girl she was naming her daughter after was alive and close and real. Ida had made that gesture when she could. She had put the name into the next generation. She had done the thing that required no postage and could not be undone by time. It was enough. It was what she had. Now come the 2 questions this entire story has been building toward. They feel like separate questions, but they are not. Why have Mary Power and Ida Brown been forgotten? And what does that forgetting tell us about whose stories get kept? The first answer is the simplest and the most consequential. They didn't write anything down. Laura wrote things down. She published them. She survived in the historical record because she built the historical record. The Pioneer Girl manuscript, the Little House series, the Missouri ruralist columns, the letters preserved across decades in archives that researchers can still walk into and read. She created the documentary infrastructure of her own memory, and that infrastructure is the reason we know what we know about her inner life, in ways we simply cannot know about the people around her. Mary and Ida left no such infrastructure. Census entries, marriage announcements in the Smet Leader. The bare bones of who they were in terms of dates and addresses and names. We have their external facts. We do not have their voices. We do not have what they thought about the friendships they lost, or the lives they built, or the particular daily texture of being a frontier woman in Kingsbury County in 1895 while the world gradually stopped paying attention to what had happened there. They are footnotes in someone else's story because they left no story of their own. This is not their failure. It is the condition of most human lives, lived fully, felt deeply, and preserved only in the external records that capture facts without capturing the person who experienced them. The second answer is harder and worth sitting with. The frontier narrative that Laura eventually built, the beloved, was a deeply embedded cultural story of pioneer life that shaped how generations of Americans understood their own history. That narrative had a shape. It required resilience. It required family love. It required the particular American mythology of the individual who perseveres against hardship and arrives eventually at something that looks like earned triumph. It required, in other words, an arc, a direction, a story that knew where it was going. Mary's life and Ida's life did not have that arc. Not because their lives were lesser, but because most lives don't. Most lives are horizontal rather than vertical. They move through time, accumulating ordinary experience, small achievements, necessary accommodations, private losses, daily continuities, without building toward anything that can be narrated as arrival. This is not failure. It is what real life looks like for most people, most of the time. Mary Power and Ida Brown were not exceptional in the way that history rewards. They were essential in the way that history ignores, and those two things, in the American frontier story as it has been told, are not treated as equivalent. Here is what we know, assembled from the census records and marriage announcements and newspaper notices and the careful archival work of researchers who went looking for the women behind the names. Mary Power was born on April 3, 1866 in New York, the daughter of Irish immigrants. She grew up in Casson, Minnesota. She came to Smet in 1880 when she was 14 years old. She was Laura Ingalls Wilder's closest friend for approximately 4 years. She married Ed Sanford in the mid-1880s. She lived in Smet until the early 1900s. She moved to Bellingham, Washington, where she lived out the final decades of her life in the grey Pacific light that was nothing like the Dakota Prairie she'd grown up on. She died on February 20th, 1929 at the age of 63. She was alive for 63 years. She loved and was loved. She built 2 households in 2 different states and navigated the economic upheavals of the late 19th century with the steady, undocumented competence that most women of her era exercised, and no one particularly noted. She died without knowing that the friend who had lost track of her was writing a book about their girlhood. Ida Bell Wright was born on September the 24th, 1866, in Chicago, Illinois. She lost her family in the Great Chicago Fire when she was 4 years old, and she was adopted by Reverend Edward Brown and his wife. She came to Smet, Dakota Territory. She was Laura Ingalls Wilder's close friend for approximately 4 years. She married Elmer McConnell on December the 3rd, 1885. She named her first daughter Laura. She spent the rest of her life in the Smet area, farming, raising children, doing the work the land required. She died in 1926 at the age of 60, 6 years before the first Little House book was published. She was alive for 60 years. She had survived the complete destruction of her family at age 4, been remade twice by other people's names and other people's households, and built, finally, on a tree claim west of Smet, a home that was hers by choice rather than by accident or charity. She had raised children on the northern plains through drought and debt, and the long, grinding recovery of a county that had survived its worst years. She had lived through more than enough to fill several books. None of it was written down. Laura Ingalls Wilder preserved both of them in amber. In Little Town on the Prairie, they are there. Mary Power, tall and dark-haired, carrying herself with the confidence of a girl who has never had cause to doubt her place in a room. Ida Brown, small and shy, with the short hairs curling at her forehead, the pastor's quiet daughter. They are vivid. They are specific. They are remembered with the precision that intense adolescent friendship burns into memory. The kind of precision that outlasts 50 years and a continent of distance. But the books do not follow them past girlhood. The books are interested in Laura becoming Laura, in the arc from childhood to marriage, from the big woods to Smet, to the wedding ceremony at the Brown house. What happened to the people in the background of that arc is not the story the books were designed to tell. So Mary and Ada were preserved forever at 13, fixed at the age when they were most vivid to Laura's literary memory, completely absent from everything that came after. The amber held them young and close and unchanged, while the actual women aged 60 and 63 years respectively, on the other side of the glass, living histories that the books had no room for, and Laura, by the end, could no longer fully recall. This is what happens to the women who don't write. Yeah, they get remembered only as far back as someone else's memory reaches, only as clearly as someone else's pen can render them, only in the moments that someone else's story required them to be present. There is a room. You have to imagine it, because no photograph survives, no sketch, no visual record of any kind. A room in Smet, South Dakota, in the early 1880s. It is winter. The kerosene lamps are lit. The stove is working hard against a cold that wants to come through the walls. The room is full of people in their best clothes, pressed close together, generating the particular warmth of a community that has decided collectively that tonight they are not going to think about the weather or the debt or the difficulty of what they are all trying to do out here on this enormous flat wind-scoured plain. In that room, 3 girls are standing near a table together. One of them will become famous. One of them will move to the Pacific coast and die there in her 60s without the famous one knowing she was still alive. One of them will spend her whole life within 20 miles of where she is standing right now, and will name her daughter after the famous one, and will die 6 years before the famous one becomes famous. None of them know any of this yet. They're just 3 girls at a party, standing close enough that their shoulders are almost touching in a warm room on a cold night, some young enough that the future still feels like something that will happen to them rather than something they're already inside of. That is the image the history kept. That is the image the history should keep. But now you know the rest of it. The 60 and 63 years that happened after the room. The continent of distance that opened between three girls who had started in the same place. The silence that accumulated where the letters should have been, and the particular quiet end of two women whose lives were full and real and almost entirely unrecorded. Mary Power Sanford, Ida Bell McConnell. Their names are in the record, if you know where to look. Now you know where to look. In 1926, Ida Bell McConnell died in Kingsbury County, South Dakota. She was 60 years old. The Smet area buried her the way it buried most of its people, with the particular local ceremony of a community that has known someone across decades, that has watched her age from a young farmer's wife into a grey-haired grandmother, that marks the loss in the way small places mark such losses. A notice in the county paper, a service at the church, the quiet rearrangement of daily life around the space where a person used to be. No national newspaper noted it. No wire service carried it. There was no reason they would. She was not famous. She had not done anything the wider world had decided to measure. 3 years later, in February of 1929, Mary Power Sanford died in Bellingham, Washington. She was 63. The Bellingham papers may have printed a brief notice. Local papers did, for local residents. But nothing of it reached the historical record that would eventually be consulted by the researchers who came looking for her. She died in the grey Pacific light of a February morning, in a city that had been her home for 2 decades, surrounded by whatever private world she and Ed had built on the far coast. The woman who had known both of them, the woman who had walked to school with them through frozen Dakota mornings, who had grown up beside them in the years before anything was written down, was in Missouri. She was 62 years old when Ida died, 63 when Mary died. Whether she knew about either death is not documented anywhere that has been found. What she was doing in those years was writing. 84 years. That is how long it took between the moment Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down to write her autobiography and the moment a scholar published the full annotated truth of what that autobiography got right, what it got wrong, and what the historical record actually showed about the people in it. Laura began the Pioneer Girl manuscript around 1930. She was working from memory, 60 years of it, compressed and shaped by the particular editorial instinct that every person applies, unconsciously, to the story of their own life. The emotional truth of her childhood came through with extraordinary fidelity. The specific sensory memories, what people wore, how light fell on a particular afternoon, the exact quality of cold in a Dakota February, were preserved with a novelist's precision. But dates blurred, sequences shifted, and the status of certain people she'd known completely at 16 and lost track of entirely by 40, was filled in by the only mechanism available when the facts are gone, assumption. She assumed Mary Power had not survived to old age. She was wrong. Mary had lived to 63, dying the year before Laura wrote those words or the year after. The chronology is close enough that the error may have been factually accurate at the moment of writing, or may have been a living woman written off as dead. Either way, the record Laura left was incomplete. It took Pamela Smith Hill to correct it. Hill spent more than a decade as editor of what would become Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, published by the South Dakota Historical Society Press in 2014. The project was not glamorous work. It was the work of cross-referencing a handwritten memoir against census records, newspaper archives, court documents, marriage registers, and decades of accumulated secondary scholarship, verifying every name, every date, every event that could be checked against an independent source, and noting, precisely and without accusation, every place where Laura's memory and the historical record diverged. There were many such places, not because Laura was dishonest. The annotations make no such claim, and the historical consensus supports none. But because human memory across 60 years is not an archive, it is a narrative, shaped by living and revising, and the slow forgetting of details that the conscious mind decided were not essential to the story being told. Laura's memory had done what all memory does over sufficient time. It had kept the feelings perfectly and let some of the facts go. The annotation for Mary Power set the record straight, quietly, precisely, in the scholarly register of a footnote that will outlast every assumption that preceded it. Mary Power did not die young. She married Edward Sanford. She moved to Bellingham, Washington. She died February 20th, 1929, at the age of 63. 84 years after Laura wrote her down as lost, the historical record wrote her back. The recovery of these two women's true histories did not happen only in the annotation of a single manuscript. It happened across decades, through a network of researchers that looked nothing like a traditional academic institution and worked with the particular intensity of people motivated by something other than professional obligation. The Laura Ingalls Wilder scholarly community, the librarians, the retired schoolteachers, the amateur genealogists, the small-town historians in South Dakota who had physical access to local records that no university library would think to acquire, had been accumulating information about Wilder's world since at least the 1950s. These were people who cared about getting it right in the specific way that comes from loving a subject rather than merely studying it. They were not looking for what the Academy had already decided mattered. They were looking for the truth about specific people, and they were willing to sit at microfilm readers in county courthouses scrolling through decades of small-type newspaper columns to find it. The South Dakota State Historical Society was a central resource. Its archives held copies of the Smet leader across the years when the three girls were growing up. Every marriage announcement, every departure notice, every social column item that recorded who was present at what event and what they were doing with their lives. Those newspapers were not indexed. Reading them meant reading all of them, slowly, looking for names. When researchers reached the records for Whatcom County, Washington, they found what Laura had believed could not exist. Mary Power Sanford, alive in Bellingham decades after Laura had written her off as gone, living out a Pacific coast life in a city built on timber and salt water and the optimism of a region still making itself. The finding was incorporated into the scholarship without ceremony, the way corrections usually are. A footnote revised, a biographical entry updated. The previous account, based on Laura's mistaken memory, quietly replaced by what the archives actually showed. This is how history corrects itself when it bothers to try. The Pioneer Girl Project, the ongoing scholarly initiative at the South Dakota Historical Society, dedicated to documenting the real people and places of Laura's world, maintains a database of biographical entries built from primary sources, census records, vital records, land records, church registers. Each entry represents hours of patient, unglamorous searching. The entries for Mary Power and Ida Brown are in that database. Their full trajectories, from the families they were born into through the lives they built and the deaths they died in, are documented there with the care that the women themselves never received while they were living it. The books were already part of the American cultural inheritance by the time any of this corrective work was done. Little House in the Big Woods had sold out its first printing in 2 months in 1932. Harper and Brothers had written immediately asking for the next book, and then the next, and for 11 years, from 1932 through 1943, Laura had produced 9 volumes in longhand at Rocky Ridge Farm, reconstructing a childhood from memory and from the Pioneer Girl notes, and building one of the most sustained and beloved literary achievements in American children's literature from the material of a life that had, for most of its duration, seemed too painful and too ordinary to be worth the telling. The books won Newbery Honor recognition 4 times. They were translated into languages Laura had never spoken. They were read by children on every continent. They were added to school curricula across America and stayed there for generations. They became, in the way that very few books do, part of the infrastructure of a country's self-understanding, woven into the way Americans told themselves about their own past, sitting on the shelf beside the myths that a culture chooses to keep because it needs them. And in those books, Mary Power and Ida Brown were preserved, not as they were at 60, not as the women they became in the years after the schoolroom and the church and the Dakota winters. They were preserved as Laura had last known them with certainty, as girls, in Smet, in the years before everything scattered. In Little Town on the Prairie and these happy golden years, they moved through the pages the way Laura remembered them moving through rooms. Mary with her particular confidence, the kind that comes from never having had genuine cause to doubt herself. Ida with her quietness that was attention rather than absence, present in the way of people who listen more than they speak. Millions of readers met them there. Millions of readers accepted them as supporting figures in the story of someone else's life. Vivid and real, and then, without explanation, simply gone from the later chapters. The way friends go when the story being told has moved past the place where they were relevant. Most readers probably never wondered what happened to them. Here is what happened to them. Mary Power Sanford spent the last 2 decades of her life in Bellingham, Washington, in a household she and Ed had made functional and stable and theirs. She was a childless woman in a community organised largely around families with children, which gives a certain kind of daily life a different shape. Quieter in some ways, more self-directed, more organised around the 2 people at the centre of it. She attended whatever church the Sanfords attended. She knew her neighbours. She aged in the Pacific Northwest the way people age there, in grey-green light, in a climate that is soft on the body after the extremity of Dakota winters, in a city that was still young enough to be building itself while she was already old enough to have a past longer than her future. She carried her Irish middle name to the end, Mary Power Sanford, in the records that listed her fully, the immigrant inheritance threaded through 4 decades of American married life, still there on the documents, still marking where she'd come from. Whether she ever thought about Laura is not recorded. Whether she followed the news from Missouri. Whether the name Laura Ingalls Wilder appeared in a newspaper she read, and produced a recognition she may or may not have acted on. We have no way of knowing. The silence between them was total and final. It had been total for so long that it had stopped being a silence about a specific person, and had become simply a fact of life, the way all long-lost things eventually stop being losses and become simply the past. She died before the books. She died the year before Little House in the Big Woods was published, February 1929, 3 years before Laura's 65-year-old face looked out from the author photograph on the jacket of the first volume. She never saw her name in print the way Laura eventually put it there. She never knew that the girl she had grown up beside had become, in her late 60s, a woman the whole country was reading. Ida McConnell died 6 years before the books, in 1926. She'd spent her entire adult life within 20 miles of the place where the friendship had been formed. Kingsbury County, the Smet area. The land she and Elmer had claimed and worked and finally made theirs. The county she died in was the same county she had arrived in as a 13-year-old girl with a new name and a new father, and no particular reason to believe that the next friendship she made would be the one she named a daughter after. She died in the place she had chosen. She died known to her neighbours and her children, and the community that had watched her grow from the pastor's quiet adopted daughter into a farm woman who had outlasted drought and debt, and the serial difficulties of a life on the northern plains. She died without the books, without knowing that the friend she had honoured in the naming of a child would eventually give that honour back, would put Ida Brown on the page for millions of readers who would recognise something true in the description, or even without knowing it was true. There are people watching this right now who have a Mary Power somewhere in their history, not a famous one, not one who will be documented and annotated and recovered by scholars 84 years after the fact, just a person who knew you when you were becoming yourself, before the job, before the marriage, before the children or the decision not to have them, before the moves and the losses that reshaped you until the person you are now shares a name with the person you were at 16 but not a daily reality. You know where some of those people are. Social media has given us something Laura never had, the ability to maintain ambient awareness of people across distance, and to know without particular effort that someone is still alive and still approximately recognisable. Mary Power relocated to Bellingham in the early 1900s, and from that moment forward Laura had no mechanism by which to simply know she was still there. The silence was complete, which is why 50 years of it resolved in Laura's mind as death. We have been spared that particular problem. But ambient awareness is not the same as knowing someone. Knowing requires what it has always required, the regular, effortful choice to reach across whatever distance exists and find out who the person has become. Not who they were at 16, who they are now, in the life the years have made for them, in the household and the geography and the daily reality you were not there to witness accumulating. That is what Laura and Mary and Ida lost. And not each other's existence, but each other's present tense, the ongoing fact of each other as people rather than as memories. What closes that distance is not technology, it is decision. Laura Ingalls Wilder died on February 10th, 1957. She was 90 years old. She had outlived Almanzo, who had died in 1949 at 92. She had outlived her sister Mary, who went blind as a young woman and died in 1928. She had outlived her parents and her sister Carrie, and nearly everyone who had known her as a girl in Smet. She had outlived, by 3 decades, both of the women who had been her closest friends in the years before everything was written down. She died at Rocky Ridge Farm, there in the stone farmhouse that had been built and rebuilt over 60 years until it was genuinely beautiful. The kind of beauty that accumulates slowly in a place where 2 people have lived long enough to know exactly what they need from every room. The apple orchard was mature by then, the kind of orchard that takes decades to become what it is, heavy with the evidence of years. The Ozark autumn would have been at its most particular that February. The bare trees, the cold clarity, the light coming sideways through the hillside timber, the way it does in that part of Missouri in winter. She was the last living person who had known Mary Power and Ida Brown when they were girls. Think about what that means. By 1957, there was no one left on Earth who carried a first-hand memory of those 2 women as they had been at 13, at 16, at 20. No one who had stood beside them in a church pew and felt the specific warmth of their presence, no one who had heard their voices in a room, no one for whom their names produced something more than text on a page. The living knowledge of who they were had narrowed, across 60 years of deaths and silences, down to a single 90-year-old woman in Missouri. And then she died too. What remained after that was only what had been written down. The census entries, the marriage announcements, the Pioneer Girl manuscript with its error about Mary corrected in the margins by a scholar not yet born when Laura wrote it. The Little House books with their vivid, loving, permanently adolescent portraits of 2 girls who had lived 60 and 63 years past the age at which they were captured on the page. And the work of the researchers who came afterward, who understood that the historical record is not a fixed thing, that it requires active maintenance, that the accuracy of what we know about the past depends on someone being willing to go looking for what has been gotten wrong and correct it with whatever the archives actually show. Those researchers gave Mary Power and Ida Brown something that fame could not have given them, and that obscurity had taken away, the truth of what actually happened. Not the version preserved in a grieving friend's memory, not the version that fit the shape of the story being told, the version that the census records and the marriage registers and the Whatcom County death notice and the Kingsbury County burial record had been holding quietly in storage for decades, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The right questions eventually were asked. The answers were found. This story began with 3 girls standing at the edge of a town that did not quite exist yet. It ends here, in the only place a story like this can honestly end. Not with a reunion, not with resolution, not with the clean emotional landing that narrative convention prefers. It ends with the plain record of what was, and what was recovered and what was lost permanently and what survived. What was lost permanently is the sound of their voices, the specific weight of what it felt like to stand next to them in a room, the private knowledge of who they were in the parts of themselves they did not perform for others, the fears, the humour, the small daily grievances, the interior life that no census record captures and no literary portrait fully renders. That is gone. It was gone when they died, and the decades since have not found a way to retrieve it. What survived is more than nothing. It is in fact considerable. It is the documented arc of 2 real lives, recovered from the silence that obscurity imposes on people who do not write their own stories. It is the knowledge that Mary Power Sanford died at 63 in Bellingham, Washington, having travelled as far across the continent as a person can travel from the Dakota Prairie and still be on the same land. It is the knowledge that Ida Bell McConnell died at 60 in Kingsbury County, South Dakota, having stayed close to the geography of her adult life, having built and kept the household that was the first one in her life to belong to her by choice. It is the knowledge that both of them were real, that they were not footnotes, that they were essential to the formation of a woman whose books shaped the self-understanding of a country, essential in the way that early friendship is always essential, in the way that the people who know you before you know yourself are always essential, in the way that being genuinely seen by someone, at the age when being seen matters most, changes you permanently in directions you spend the rest of your life moving in without fully knowing why. They were that for Laura. She was that for them. The record says so, if you know how to read it. Mary Power Sanford, born April 3rd, 1866, died February 20th, 1929. Aged 63. She came from New York. She grew up in Minnesota. She walked to school through Dakota winters. She moved to the Pacific coast and died there, in the grey February light of a city that had become home. She was Laura Ingalls Wilder's closest friend for 4 years, at the age when 4 years is a lifetime. Ida Bell McConnell, born September 24th, 1866, died 1926, aged 60. She was orphaned at 4 in a city fire. She was given a new name and a new family and a new home. She built a third home by choice on a tree claim on the northern plains, and she stayed in it. She named her first daughter Laura. Their names are in the record. You have just heard their story.